very, very warm welcome to everybody tonight. My name is Nick Dearden. I am the Director of Global Justice Now, and we've really been inundated with interest in this webinar tonight. So I know we've got over 100 here today. We had around 400 signed up, so we're expecting more will join us. But obviously, we've got so much to get through, so much to hear from our wonderful speakers. So I'm going to crack on, if that's okay with everybody. And while we don't have a chat, we do have a Q&A function where you will be able to ask questions of us, of the panelists. So do, as you're listening to people, put your questions in there, and we'll see how many we get. The team here will try and sift them and sort them and make sure that we get through as many as we possibly can this evening. I'm just going to open by saying I find it really hard to know what to say in the face of this mass murder that we see being perpetrated against an imprisoned and occupied people. And obviously, I know that you will all, as am I, watching this in real time, broadcast across social media. But as awful as these images are, what I think makes the whole situation truly intolerable for us is that this extreme violence has been met by our political class and many of our institutions with complicity, as if nothing out of the ordinary is happening, as if this is some kind of a nasty spat between two irreconcilable sides, and there's nothing here to prevent business as usual, with the party committing some of the most heinous war crimes I've ever seen. And that business as usual, of course, includes supplying the military equipment and the know-how that is allowing these claims to take place. As the Palestinian ambassador to the United Nations said just a couple of hours ago to the Security Council, Israel's war crimes have been committed openly, brazenly, and repeatedly. And what is happening in Gaza is going down as the most documented genocide in history. When will the world denounce the crimes and stop tolerating their recurrence? And really, for Global Justice Now, an organization, although I have some history of working on this issue, my organization before the last 6 months had not worked on this issue before, but we feel and felt and still feel that as an internationalist organization as ours is, it's very clear that the narrative that is allowing this to happen can only thrive in the context of deep levels of dehumanization and racism. A dehumanization and racism which to one extent or another is the heart of so many of the injustices and inequalities in the world that we fight for. And so as internationalists, we really can't be silent on this issue. We have to take a stand and demand not only an immediate end to the violence, but an end to the decades of dehumanization and violence which have brought us to this awful place. So what does this concretely mean? Well, our number one demand at the moment, and the number one demand of the panelists on this webinar, is an immediate suspension of military relations with Israel and an arms embargo. And I believe that we have a small window of opportunity here with a new government which of course has taken a terrible position for many months on Gaza, but nonetheless is under the most intense pressure from some of their own supporters. And so I think we have this window of opportunity to maximize that pressure, to force them to do what they should have called for from the very beginning. And I think and I hope that the number of people signing up for the webinar tonight, probably the biggest we've ever done, as I say, is proof that many, many of you feel the same. So tonight, we are going to give you the background to this issue, to explain why we're doing what we're doing, why we think it's so important, and to explore some ways that hopefully you can get involved if you aren't already. As I say, we're still not quite sure. I think the chat function is still not working, but please do ask questions, and we will put those to our panelists at the end. And I'll introduce the panelists, if it's okay, as we go through. But just to name them at the beginning, we've got Jeff, Yasmin, Jonathan, and Blanca. I'm really looking forward to hearing what you've all got to say. But we're going to start off with a very old friend of mine, Jeff Halper, author of War Against the People, Israel, the Palestinians, and Global Pacification, the head of the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions, and co-founder of the One Democratic State campaign, Jeff has been a tireless activist on this issue. When I first was introduced to the issue and did a tour of the occupied Palestinian territories, Jeff was there giving me huge amounts of information. Must have been 20 years ago now. And tonight, I'm really, really pleased that you're still at it, Jeff, and it must be incredibly difficult for you. But you're going to provide, I think, an overview of the way Israel uses high-tech military apparatus against the Palestinian population, how this technology is exported around the globe to repress other groups, and what we can do about it. Over to you.
All right, thank you very much, Nick. And thanks to Global Justice Now for inviting me, and all of you for being with me on this panel. I mean, Gaza is obviously at the center of our attention, and properly so. It is a genocide. You know, the International Criminal Court is talking about trying Israel for plausible genocide or genocide, but we can all see very clearly, as Nick had said, that this is genocide, mass murder, and so on. I think what we have to start with Israel for understanding where Israel's coming from before we get to Gaza is that genocide is built into settler colonialism. In other words, you ask the question, why Israel? I mean, it's supposed to be a Jewish country. Jews have never been known for being especially genocide. On the contrary, Jews were the victims of one of the greatest genocides in history, the Holocaust. So how could this all of a sudden come about? Was there a massive change in mentality or ideology or... No, what happened is that, and I'm not going to get into this, it's another discussion, but Zionism is a settler colonial movement. In other words, it was designed and intended until today, and very upfront, to invade Palestine, basically, and take over the country. Take the Palestinians' lands, dispossess them, replace them with Jewish settlers, and completely then redo the country as a Jewish country, to transform an Arab country into a Jewish country. You can't do that without genocide. That is the definition of genocide. And so I think the reason why Israel, and I don't think it was intended necessarily, you know, there's a logic to systems. You know, we're all against capitalism and neoliberal capitalism, but we all live our lives that way. I mean, it's very hard to develop an alternative lifestyle unless you want to drop out, you know, in which you're not enmeshed in the whole capitalist system that we abhor. And it's the same thing with settler colonialism. I don't think we should necessarily be demonizing Israelis, although they have to be held accountable, and they are doing this in a very conscious way. But I think the more important issue is that we're involved in a genocidal political system that's based on genocide. And so what we have now in Palestine is the culmination of that process after 130 years. In other words, Zionism, since 1948 in the form of Israel, has taken control of all of Palestine. There is basically only one ruling entity over all of Palestine from the river to the sea, which is why Amnesty and Human Rights Watch and the UN call it an apartheid regime. And now, you know, the way you end settler colonialism from the settler colonial point of view is to normalize it. And now we're in a situation, and even the terminology is interesting. Biden is talking about normalization between Israel and especially Saudi Arabia, but, you know, a continuation of Trump's Abrahamic agreements or accords with the so-called pro-Western Arab world. And so I think Israel in Gaza is rushing to quell the last bastion of resistance to Zionism. But we have to remember it's also doing the same in the West Bank. You know, Israel is attacking the Tulkarm and Jenin refugee camps with the same conventional military weapons as it is Gaza: tanks, drones, artillery, special forces, robotics, and so on. And so that's kind of the political context. So there's a chance here, just to ratchet up this issue of stop arming Israel, the urgency. There's really a chance here that a settler colonial regime, Israel, Zionism, could in fact ethnically cleanse a population, commit genocide in order to nail down its repopulation of the entire country and normalize itself with the help of our governments. I mean, that is a real possibility, and that's something we have to face. And so, of course, that's the piece of it. That's why Israel is in Gaza. And of course, we all know that Israel uses the occupied territories as a laboratory for developing its weapon systems and surveillance systems and so on. And the same is true in Gaza today. Entire systems like AI systems for targeting. AI is producing more targeting than the Israeli Air Force can attack. And robotics, and new forms of weaponized drones, and new forms of surveillance, and new forms of tunnel detection, all kinds of, I mean, there's whole systems that are being experimented with today. But I just want to go one step further, because it isn't only why is Israel doing this, which is the genocide that's built into its settler colonial project, but we might ask, how does Israel get away with it? This was the basic question of my book, War Against the People. That's how I opened it. Because what we have to understand, of course, is that the Palestinians are not the final victims in this development of Israeli weapon systems and tactics of population control. I mean, like we say, it's a laboratory. I mean, the laboratory is the laboratory. That's where you have the guinea pigs. That's where you try out different experiments, but the guinea pigs are not the end users. It's for export. And because Israel has been in a war against the Palestinian people for the past more than a century now, with the genocide built into it, and therefore with the militarism built into it, and this idea really of eliminating the Palestinian people, not simply repressing them or driving them out, but actually erasing them, that's given Israel a kind of a niche in the world system today, because it's led Israel to develop kinds of weaponry that are used not against conventional armies. I mean, the Palestinians never had a conventional army, but that are used against the people. Whether the people are more organized, as in the sense of Hamas and previous Palestinian resistance movements, in which you're fighting guerrilla fighters or resistance fighters, or whether it's against people in general, the 85% of humanity that lives under the poverty line, or all the middle class young people of the global north that are being excluded from the capitalist system. And so war against the people then is being exported, as Nick said, it's being exported both to global north regimes, the United States, Europe, NATO in particular, because Israel has become a kind of an enforcer of global capitalism. The Pentagon, with its $1 trillion budget, and its F-16s and nuclear submarines and so on, does not have the weapons to pursue a war against the people. The British government, the European governments, NATO, they're all designed for conventional warfare. They're prepared to fight China. It's Israel, on the basis of its century-long war on the Palestinians, that has the weaponry and the tactics of population control and repression that is much more suited to repressing populations in the world that are either revolting against neoliberal capitalism, that's keeping them impoverished and robbing their countries, or that are victims of repressive regimes. I mean, the reason why Saudi Arabia and Egypt and Jordan and other Arab countries are desperate to normalize with Israel isn't because they love Israel or Zionism. It's because they need its technologies of repression in order to repress their own peoples. So I think that we have to put, I just have a few minutes, I know I have to finish up, I think. But so in other words, we have to put, and I think this is what Global Justice Now tries to do, we have to put what's happening in Gaza, and now I'm saying this with hesitation because I don't want to deflect attention from Gaza. We have to focus on what's happening in Gaza and what Israel is doing and the genocide and the weaponry. We have to certainly focus on what's going on the West Bank. and this whole process of normalization that Biden and NATO are trying to pursue. But at the same time, there's a global perspective, what I call global Palestine. And that is, in many ways, the real significance globally of what Israel is doing. And Israel's, the tactics it develops, the technology of repression, their surveillance, the weaponry of repression that it develops on the Palestinians is going to be exported to your countries. And so as your police forces and your security forces and your militaries are being Israelized, you are being Palestinianized. And I want to just say one more sentence. I think what's been crucial, and I think Yasmin and others will talk about the student movement. What's been crucial is the reaching out to other oppressed groups in society, the intersectionality that's really going on. And I think that's crucial. And so if we take the arms issue in this context of a global war against the people and the Palestinianization of the people, in fact, we've then expanded what could be a single issue topic, stop arming Israel, or anti-war issues, and we've already begun to expand it in a way that it addresses the needs of other groups that maybe aren't particularly interested in arms, but are the victims of war against the people that Israel is the main pursuant of. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you so much, Jeff. I think that's really, really clear and really important to have that kind of geopolitical systems analysis, because it helps us, I think, understand what otherwise, appears like sadism to us, and the threat posed to everybody that the Palestinians are obviously on the front line of at the moment. It's interesting that the British government, for example, has been desperate to deepen its economic cooperation with Israel over the last few years, and by that, it specifically is looking at IT systems, AI, security systems, and indeed, our government has been having regular trade meetings with Israel to try to sign an enhanced agreement over the last few months, as if nothing was happening. So I think that helps us to contextualize some of what's going on. Now, I'm really, thank you. So I'm really, really pleased that Yasmin Ashraf is here from the Palestinian Youth Movement in Britain, which is an independent grassroots movement of young Palestinians, both living here, but also in exile around the world, and in exile around the world, of course, primarily as a result of the ongoing Israeli occupation of Palestine. And I think, Yasmin, you're going to provide an overview of the youth protests that have been happening around the UK, but also around the US. Some of the, it is those protests that have given me more hope than anything in this current context. So I want to thank you for all of the work the movement is doing to make that happen, particularly the rise of the student encampments. And you're going to tell us how the Palestinian Youth Movement is galvanizing young people to take action. Over to you.
Thank you, Nick, and thank you so much for the invitation. I'm really glad to be here tonight with everyone. So yeah, like Nick said, I'm a member of the Palestinian Youth Movement. We're the largest political organization composed of Palestinian Arab youth in exile, and we come out of a very specific historical juncture, namely the Oslo Accords that destroyed our national institutions and severed the diaspora from being able to serve our liberation struggle, especially from exile. And part of the vision of the PYM is rebuilding a tradition of political organizing that is disciplined and understands the necessary sacrifices it's going to take to be able to accumulate experience, lessons, and wins, and to build power in order to actually advance the Palestinian movement overall. So I'm going to speak about the student encampments, but I'm also going to touch a little bit on the relationship between like student organizing and disrupting the imperial Zionist war machine, but also more broadly like what the PYM has been doing around the arms trade. So I actually want to start a little bit by reflecting on the historic role of students in the Palestinian struggle, because I think that historical grounding is useful to understand how like students have built power over the last 10 months of organizing, and how that builds off of like decades of student organization. So one of the central organizations that propelled the Palestinian struggle was GUPS, and GUPS is the General Union of Palestinian Students, and it was really significant to the launching of the Palestinian Revolution in 1964 by the Palestinian Liberation Organization. And actually, GUPS was the first Palestinian organization to explicitly name, it had a charter in 1959 that explicitly named that it was really important for Palestinians to form a national liberation struggle until victory. And their organizational form, their methods of developing analysis and assessment, their tactics of producing propaganda to agitate the masses, the way they organize students, all of these things would go on to inform the structure and the organization of the PLO, and many of the leaders of Palestinian factions and the PLO's own executive government were forged in the student movement. And so it's important to recount this history because students in the student movement have always played a central role in advancing the Palestinian struggle. And we are really reminded of this in April when the encampment launched in Colombia reignited mass international student mobilizations that not only gripped the world's attention, brought it back to the unfolding genocide in Gaza, but also it was a point where morale was really low and the poison of defeat was kind of entering the movement a little bit. And so students revitalized the movement and reminded us that as long as we resist, we haven't been defeated. And historically, if you look at a lot of struggles, students have played that role, and youth in general. And that's like kind of the way that that's our assessment of like what the particular encampment that happened at Colombia did, even though we know that wasn't like the first occupation, not in America nor in Europe nor anywhere in the world that was protesting like institutional complicity with the genocide. And so there's a couple of things I want to name about the student movement here in Britain. Firstly, to say that student mobilizations in solidarity with Palestine and against institutional complicity in the genocide have been happening since October 7th. And we saw coordinated national student walkouts happen on a weekly basis as soon as the genocide started. We saw like campaigns being reignited against like academic partnerships with Zionist education institutions or against like university investments in arms companies. And these obviously are longstanding campaigns that have been happening for a very long time. And we saw like many universities go into occupation prior to the encampment at Columbia, but the scale of the repression and the sweep that the students at Columbia faced like ignited students and mobilized them into action again. And I think there's something really, there's an important distinction, which is that the quality of repression that students in America faced is quite different to the repression that students in Britain face. And so in the immediate aftermath of October 7th, we saw that students were being investigated, arrested by police and by counter-terror police for statements or for like social media posts. And the way that that repression works is kind of like it's more silent, it has a chilling effect, which means that it doesn't like galvanize mobilization in the same way unless the student that faces this repression chooses to like go public about it. And I think that's an important distinction. Maybe can explain a little bit about why the expression of student resistance in this country has looked maybe a bit different to what's been happening in North America. But I also wanted to say that like historically the student movement in Britain has been is like a product of like the student movement as it currently exists is a product of like the cumulative like lessons and experiences that have happened in the student movement here, but also of the repression that shapes it. So for example, like we can think to the suspension of Shaymat Dalali from her position as the president of the National Union of Students. And a few years before her, Malia Bouattia was also faced a really brutal wave of repression, not just by like the institution, the NUS itself, but by the whole government. And those are really important like historic moments because it actually helps it. They're like kind of expressions of like a systematic way that student power in this country has been decimated. And if we look at like the institutions that have historically organized students, like democratic political institutions like student unions and the national umbrella that houses them, the National Union of Students, these have been systematically gutted through funding cuts, through things like privatization, turning student unions from political bodies into charities that limit their political mandate. All of these things are like structural, intentional processes that have taken place in order to decimate student power. And yet, despite all of this, we saw like the student movement like rebuilding itself over the last couple of months, and off the back of like years of mobilization, despite the fact that they were disrupted so heavily by those kinds of by this kind of repression. And it's kind of, and what I'm trying to do is paint a picture of how these like structural factors of the ways the institutions within the student movement were weakened, with like the individual targeting through investigations, through whether those be like university investigations or police investigations, have kind of attempted to weaken the student movement and attempted to silence students. But despite all of that, like when the encampment at Columbia happened and the international student uprising emerged, students across the country set up over 35 encampments, and some of these encampments are still ongoing. And we can kind of debate the effectiveness of the tactic and like materially what these encampments have achieved. But it's really important that the students were able to demonstrate such a nationally coordinated display of power. And it really showed how much students have actually built like skills like coalition building on campus, thinking about like how can they leverage the occupations to advance campaigns that they had already been working on their campuses. But also they were able to reintegrate their campuses back into their communities, which is something that has intentionally been stripped away from students through the privatization of university campuses. And all of these things are lessons that student organizers are going to carry forward with them to the next academic year, but also more broadly to organizing off campus. Like one of the most important functions of student movements as we know it is producing organizers that then go on and build national political projects. And we even see that like a lot of us in the Palestinian youth movement are like, we're forged in the student movement. We know like a lot of the organizing ecosystem in this country is like a product, an outgrowth of the student movement. But also at the same time, we saw encampments, which are ultimately a tactic, become the end goal. And one of the things we were able to do was kind of strategically try to support students in thinking through like what is the purpose of the encampment, like how do you actually build power through this form of mobilization. And we were able to support students through like a whole variety of different like practical things, like different kinds of trainings, media trainings, negotiation training, how to actually think about like how are you going to achieve like the material goals. And one of the greatest things to come out of the occupations and encampments was the international connections that have been forged between student movements in this country, in North America and Europe and other parts of the world. And also we actually saw like the political possibilities of what students can do around like divestment and academic boycott increasingly open up. So we've actually seen like material wins. And even though like that's not necessarily owed to a particular tactics, it's owed to the overall strength of the movement being like completely transformed since October 7th. We actually have witnessed like university administrations being forced to contend with that thing that Jeff was kind of speaking to, which is the impunity and the exceptionalism around Zionism has kind of slipped away. And students and workers in universities are increasingly willing to disrupt business as usual to demonstrate a rejection of the complicity in Zionism and in the genocide. And again, like the student movement is always like a reflection of the broader movement. And what we saw over the last couple of months was that like almost like, I don't know, 8 years of like different actors trying to isolate the student movement for Palestine from the broader Palestinian movement, all of that effort kind of slipped away within the span of a couple of weeks. And the student movement has never been as integrated into the broader Palestinian movement as it is today, which is a really, really important achievement in the face of such intense repression. And so, as I said, one of the like central demands of the encampments of student organizing on British campuses for years has been for the ending of institutional complicity in the arms supply chain destined for the Zionist entity. And the demand for an arms embargo has for decades been central to the Palestinian movement internationally. And especially from our position in the Imperial Core, we have the ability to disrupt the arms chain, and that is a strategic strength that we as a movement can exercise, and we have been exercising for the last couple of months. And so I just quickly want to end by saying that like the mass mobilizations that we've witnessed across the country for the last 10 months have made the arms embargo demand a truly popular demand. Like everyone associates it with the Palestinian movement, which is something that we shouldn't take for granted. Like this wasn't the same picture before October 7th. And so we understand that like the movement has gone through like an intense cycle of growth over the last 10 months, and we have a responsibility now to consolidate that growth. And that's why we've launched a campaign against the logistics giant Maersk, because we know that logistics companies are kind of like silent profiteers in the arms supply chain. And there's a lot of different ways that Maersk is complicit in the genocide, but some of the key things is that it transports parts of like fighter jets from different places in Europe, including Britain, to the US. And then from the US, they have partnerships with the Department of Defense, transporting completed and weapons parts to the Zionist entity. And that's across multiple arms companies. And so if we target logistics companies, we can actually take on multiple arms companies at the same time. And so, and it's also like a way for the transnational nature of our movement to exercise its strength. So there are lots of different ways that we can advance an arms embargo. And we believe that an arms embargo from below through like strategic campaigns like this can not only consolidate our movement, but actually materially advance an arms embargo, because we need pressure from all different angles, like from the top, but also really importantly, a way for the mass popular character of our movement to translate that power into material solidarity for Palestine. And so, yeah, if you're interested at all in this campaign, I'll put the email to the Britain Palestinian Youth Movement. I'll put the email in the chat. And yeah, we have a responsibility to be true to the slogans that we raise. So when we say in our millions, we are Palestinians, we understand that to mean that we need to struggle for liberation in Palestine and liberation here. And Zionism has never been weaker. And so we will see a liberated Palestine within our lifetime.
Thank you very much, Yasmin. And you are able to do that now, I believe, because I think we have to chat online. So thank you for that. And I know I've seen some people saying hello in there. Please feel free to do that as well. So thank you, Yasmin. I'm going to pass straight over to Jonathan Purcell, who is the Senior Public Affairs and Communications Officer at the International Center for Justice for Palestinians, which is an independent coalition of lawyers, politicians, and academics supporting the rights of Palestinians through law. And I think, Jonathan, you're going to be outlining the work that the Centre has been doing to support legal actions to suspend UK arms sales to Israel, and also to stop the recruitment of British citizens into the Israeli Defence Force.
Thanks for that introduction, Nick. So the urgency of this topic is self-evident. Only last week, there was a study in The Lancet, one of the most esteemed medical journals in the country, which estimated that the death toll in Gaza now stands at a staggering 186,000 people, killed in just over 9 months. It's a genocide so large that it's hard to even talk about its scale without dehumanizing each individual life that has been taken away by the Israeli Defense Forces. And in that time, there's another key figure too. So over 100 new arms exports were granted by the UK government from the 7th of October 2023 until the 31st of May 2024. That is according to the government's own transparency data, which was released just last month. And how much both of those numbers have increased in the last month and a half is anyone's guess, which really highlights the urgency. Now, I just want to talk briefly first about precedents in other countries. So Canada the Netherlands, Japan, Spain, and Belgium have ended arms exports to Israel in the last few months, just to name a few. And I specifically picked global north countries to highlight how Britain can't just use their diplomatic position and their global standing as an excuse not to act. It's of course clear and important to point out that in the global south, many countries have had a far more principled and stronger stance on ending arms exports, as indeed they do on many other matters too, such as the recognition of a Palestinian state. But to go back to one of the examples I mentioned just now, a particularly interesting example is Canada. So ICEJP has a Canadian branch as well, so we do a lot of work over there too. Now, Canada sent 26 million Canadian dollars worth of weapons to Israel in 2021. In 2022, it was 21 million. And then in October and November of last year alone, the government authorized 28 million. In 2 months, it surpassed what it had done each of the previous years. So this was a massive increase compared to where the Canadian government had been before. And that's where they were in October and November. Despite that, the Canadian House of Commons did pass a motion to halt arms exports on the 18th of March. It's worth pointing out that this is still only a temporary ban, and it's a ban on new exports rather than existing ones too. So obviously we would be advocating for a far stronger position than that. But even so, their position has moved so much compared to where they were in October, where they were actively increasing arms exports. And that decision to ban exports came only a week after a coalition, which included our Canadian branch, issued a notice of intention to take legal action against the Canadian government, citing arms exports explicitly as one of the factors in that decision. The Canadian Foreign Ministry also faced a separate legal challenge from Al-Haq and its partners as well, so it was facing two. And it changed its mind a week after that was submitted. And this goes to show the strength of the role that legal advocacy can play as a tool as we're looking to ban exports here as well. But equally, it's important to point out it can't be the only factor. We need many strings to our bow as a movement. That includes grassroots protesting, union action, student encampments and the like, which I think this panel has already spoken to and will continue to speak to. We all come from, different niches working towards the same thing. And I think that's the vital tool in terms of solidarity when it comes to trying to ban exports here. And thinking about that united struggle is an important way to move forwards when we think about how we can end British complicity in Israel's genocide in Gaza as well. So I just wanted to start briefly with that little bit of context on Canada, just to give people some hope. Canada was not a pro-Palestinian country in October. It's not one now, but they have got to a point where new export licenses have been stopped. There is hope here as well. So now I'm going to talk about the British situation in a little bit more detail. So for those of you who don't know, there's something called the Foreign Affairs Select Committee in the British political system. So that's a group of MPs who are picked to scrutinise the Foreign Office on their policies. The chair of that committee is a Conservative MP, it was until the election. There will be a new set picked now. But she was called Alicia Cairns. From October until a few weeks ago, when the government changed, the Sunak government said they had received legal advice that said that they were allowed to continue arms exports to Israel. But then in March, Alicia Cairns said that the government had received legal advice that Israel has broken international humanitarian law, but they had decided not to announce it. So let's talk about the legal advice. ICJP is a legal organization ourselves, so we certainly have a view on what it probably looks like. Forgive me, but I am about to launch into a very legal section of this talk, but it's important, so please bear with. So it seems extremely likely that any reasonable legal advice would say that Israel has broken international humanitarian law, actually on countless grounds. There's an innumerate amount of war crimes and crimes against humanity that have been committed. So if the government legal advice does say this, which it almost definitely does, and if the government knew this, which Alicia Kearns say they did, and they chose to continue to export arms, then that means they would have broken their own set of rules. It's something called the Strategic Arms Exporting Criteria. And in those rules, it says that arms can't be exported to countries that are breaking international humanitarian law. So they've broken their own rules that they've set, but also there's a case to be made that they've broken international legal obligations as well. Now, one of the most important one of these is the Genocide Convention. The UK is a state party to this, so we signed up to it and said that we would follow its rules. In the Genocide Convention, it says that a state party cannot aid and abet a country that is committing genocide. But not only that, the bar is actually even lower. It says that they can't even aid and abet a country if there is a risk of genocide, and it says they must do everything in their power to not aid and abet and to prevent a genocide from taking place. So the bar is actually incredibly low. And given that the ICJ has ruled that Israel is plausibly committing genocide in Gaza, that bar has comfortably been met, considering it's only the risk of genocide. So the UK government, both before and now, are at risk of breaking their own departmental rules, breaking international obligations, and actually breaking domestic law too, because a lot of these international treaties have been transposed into UK law as well. So now that the logic of the case has been laid out, I'll talk about the case that's actually been put forward. So my organization, the ICJP, they're supporting Global Legal Action Network and Al-Haq, who are the main organizations who are taking the UK government to court over weapons exports. Extraordinarily, this case was actually initially dismissed by the High Court, but following an appeal in April, it was allowed to go ahead, and now there's going to be a full hearing in October. So that's when we can expect to see major updates. But it's already started to gain quite a bit of momentum. So on the 13th of June, Oxfam Great Britain, Human Rights Watch, and Amnesty UK also received permission to intervene in the case as well. And also, even in the course of this case already, which has only had some preliminary hearings, we've already found from court documents that the government has had to hand over that the government actively made a decision to continue arms exports only a week after the World Central Kitchen attack, in which 8 workers were killed, including 3 British citizens. Now, the evidence that the government used to make that decision was out of date. It only went up to January. So it's astounding that they didn't factor in the crucial information of the World Central Kitchen attack when they made that decision. So we now know that already as a result of the case. As it continues to go forward, you can only imagine what we're likely to find out through court documents being released. So that's the state of the case right now. That's my overview, but willing to take more questions on it in due course. And I'd just like to end on a little bit of history to give a slight optimistic note, as I did when I started. So it's important to say this has happened before. There is a precedent, not just in other countries like Canada now, but in this country in the past. I think people often have quite short memories, especially it's understandable given how much has happened since October. But what Israel does, it's increased its scale, but the way in which it's operated has happened time and time again in 2021, in 2014, and in 2008, and innumerate times back to the Nakba. But in particular, in 2009, the British government revoked arms exports because of the 2008 Operation Cast Lead. That's a decision that happened. It's a decision that can happen again. As appalling as the inaction we've seen by the British government in the last 9 months has been, this is something we have to latch onto. There is a reason to keep fighting for peace.
Thank you very, very much, Jonathan, and thanks for the cases that you're involved in and all the work you're doing, which does indeed give me hope. Finally, let me pass over to Blanca Suarez, a trade unionist involved in Workers for a Free Palestine, which is an amazing organization doing some fabulous stuff, including organizing a protest next week that we're going to encourage you all to get involved in. But Workers for a Free Palestine organizes mass pickets to shut down weapons factories complicit in Israel's genocide against Palestine. And I think, Blanca, you're going to talk to us about that work, why it's so important, and how people can get involved. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the invitation as well. Yeah, I think I wanted to bring today two thoughts. One was on the importance of organizing and focus on the arms industry and enforcing an arms embargo from below. And the second on the importance of building international solidarity in a way that is rooted in material and practical solidarity. So that's what I wanted to try and bring up through the 10 minutes that I have. I hope it comes up. For the ones that don't know it, Workers for Palestine is a collective that started organizing in October in response to the genocide and to calls from Palestinian workers and trade unions for actions against the arms trade. So this was an international call by Palestinian unions, and we were set up as a collective for worker and work-to-worker solidarity. We started organizing mass blockades of factories, and these were done by workers and trade unionists, including healthcare workers, higher education workers, charity workers, cultural workers, and service workers, as well as Palestinian activists and students, climate activists, and others. These are one-day blockades that are temporarily shut down arms factories, and they have cost the arms companies millions of pounds so far, as well as starting conversations amongst arms workers in the factories. And these blockades have also shifted the national conversation around an arms embargo and led to shifts in the political positions of some trade unions and the mainstream Palestinian solidarity movement. Our group is based in London, and we've organized 5 factory blockades so far. And inspired by our actions, other groups in Scotland, Wales, and the northwest of England have set up and have organized more than 10 blockades at arms factories between them. So one of the first things I want to say is the focus on the arms industry and our approach to this. And you have to think that these collective was started in October when everyone was just talking about ceasefire as a demand, and arms embargo was not even on the horizon. Was a focus on the strategic necessity of disrupting the manufacture and supply of arms to Israel. And this is because the supply of arms to the US and to Israel from the US, Europe, it enables them to it enables the Zionist project to conduct war and sustain the settler colonial project. So Israel does have some domestic arms production, but it is largely reliant on arms produced abroad. And without the arms and munitions that we are producing in this country, Israel would not be able to carry on the settler colonial project. So for these reasons, we believe that achieving an arms embargo must be a central goal for any Palestinian solidarity movement in this country right now. And the way that we're approaching this is enforcing an arms embargo, what we are calling an arms embargo from below, or what we've been calling a people's arms embargo. So the arms embargo from below is basically focusing on disrupting production, disrupting transportation, and disrupting licensing and selling of arms in any way possible. And this is opposed as a strategy from above, which focuses on lobbying politicians to act. right? We are also basing our strategy in a workers' strategy. We believe that the workers' movement is the best place to disrupt the production and disruption of arms and enforce an arms embargo. We're not interested in small groups of activist circles. We want to build a mass workers' movement in solidarity with Palestine that is capable of taking action and enforcing arms embargo, and want to be able to build collective power in key strategic sectors on a mass level. So we understand ourselves as workers, and from that positionality, we are able to think of ways of building collective power and disrupt capital and the war machine, as George was saying before, because Israel is enforcing global capitalism as well as with this Settler project. So wanted to talk a bit about the strategy that we've been following. We've been following an inside-outside strategy through blockades, which have a direct impact on the production, but also as a form of action that is accessible for a much wider layer of people than a small direct actions. So this has given us greater potential to scale up the movement. Most often our actions have 400 to 600 people coming and attending on a weekday, which is impressive and quite large, because so far mobilization has only been able to mobilize people towards protest in London, and these are actions that are happening on the countryside, sometimes 5 hours away from London, and we are busing up and transporting at least 600 people to blockade factories. So this has been useful both to disrupt and to inspire others to organize more blockades, and also as a way to recruit wider layers of people to engage in other parts of our strategy. Alongside the blockades, we've also been organizing and building relationships with arms workers through leafleting at factories and through tapping into networks in our unions. We believe that arms workers can be won around, and our position is that we think that ultimately they have the power to halve the arms supply, and it's much greater than whatever we can do on the outside. We've been seeing this with workers in Italy, in Spain, in Belgium, and all across Canada and the US as well. So it is quite important to be able to think through a strategy that also involves arms workers. And at the end, and all the last bit that we've been doing is organizing open meetings with workers who are interested in starting organizing in their workplaces in solidarity with Palestine. So if you think about your workplace, almost all of our employees have ties in some way with the Zionist project, whether it is direct relationships with arms companies or investments and commercial ties with the Israeli economy. And as a result of this, we have started to see a number of initiatives by workers to take collective action and pressure their employees to end complicity with Israel, from divesting pension funds to ending relationships with armed companies, as we've seen in the universities. The main progress so far has been with healthcare workers, targeting contracts with Palantir, charity and cultural workers, targeting the Tate and Saddlewells, and higher education workers that have been pressuring their institutions to cut research contracts with armed companies. And this has been able to add other angles and pressure to our strategy. So this inside and outside the strategy is starting to build momentum. At the last blockade in Glasgow, several hundreds of armed factory workers collaborated with the blockade against management instructions to enter the site. And the workers pointed out that the blockade was happening. They walked slowly. They refused to enter through the entrance that was indicated. And at the end, they allowed the blockade to block the new entrance, and left home and didn't work for the day. Some of these workers are now trying to organize towards action by workers on the inside of the factory to stop producing certain arm components. We've also seen a group of workers in a factory that supplies parts to one of the arms that have started an unofficial boycott and refused to make those parts. We're also aware of some workers at another side who have just joined a group of factory workers organizing in solidarity with Palestine and following on from one of the blockades. And the reps inside the factories, the trade union reps, including many of who are in the right politically, because let's speak honestly, a lot of workers are conservative and on the right, have recently published a statement, which is quite good and goes further than the reactionary position of their own union leadership, and calls for the government to ban direct export license to Israel, as well as encouraging arms workers to engage with people, taking part in blockades when they happen. So this is huge steps forward, and a lot of developments in the last 8 years. And I just wanted to finalize this reflection to say that we started and continue to organize and to mobilize with the feeling that each action that we take needs to be rooted in an understanding of international solidarity that is material and practical. We are not acting on a moral sense or in a guilt sense, and we are not acting on a feeling of sympathy for a distant struggle. We understand that our work and our struggles are interconnected, and that we need to build a joint struggle for liberation. We also understand, as Jasmine was saying, that we are in the belly of the beast. Britain ruled over and laid the foundations for ethnic cleansing in Palestine, but also imperialism shaped the living conditions of people in Britain. And when we are doing internationalist work, we need to question how the imperialist project affected and shaped the political, economical, and social conditions in the UK. And we need to understand that many of the problems we face as the working class in our country are intrinsically tied to the situation in Palestine, whether it's the lack of funding for public services due to expenditure on war, the dominance of global corporations who plunder from the Middle East as well as from our communities, or the racist surveillance and policing practices that are brought back from Israel to London. So, as Workers for Free Palestine, we are committed to build a long-term solidarity project. We will continue as long as the arms supply to Israel continues from Britain. And as Nick was mentioning, we are having an action next week. If you are in London or if you're in Glasgow or Edinburgh, I encourage you to join us. Blockades are a really easy access action to join. You can bring kids to the picket. We have food, we have dances, we have music, we do stretches. We talk with the workers, and it's always a very joyful experience. This action will be in central London. You can just ask for a couple hours at the beginning of your morning before heading to work, and tell the new government that it is time for them to enforce an arms embargo and not just talk about a ceasefire. Solidarity and Free Palestine.
Thank you very, very much, Blanca. And you've just posted that, haven't you? The link that people need to sign up to if they are able to come next Wednesday. And please, if there's any possibility that you can get there, please get there and bring friends and colleagues if you can as well, because I think it's really crucial. So we've got lots of questions, which I'm now going to ask our panelists, but you're still welcome to add. We've got half an hour or so for questions. There's a set of questions, I think, all around campaign strategy. And I do think one of the key problems that we faced over the last few months is a growing sense of despair that I think you've all done your best to dispel, which is great. And indeed, as somebody who worked on this issue many years ago, I do feel that there is phenomenal support in our society. Even in a society like British society, there is phenomenal support for the Palestinian people at this time. There is enormous support for an arms embargo. We were at a music festival a couple of weeks ago and were carrying Palestinian flags around, and it was extraordinary, the number of just ordinary people who came up to us to express sympathy. But given that, I think people are really struggling with what more can we do? What can we do next? And you've given us some things, but I wonder whether you could maybe answer one of the questions on strategy here. So we've got one question here, which is that many workers in arms factories are likely to be unionized, and trade union leaders. You've talked about that a little bit, Blanca, but there is to some degree a kind of marginalization or an ignoring of what's happening. Are there plans to put motions down to lobby, for example, at TUC conference in the autumn? There is a question on direct action, like some of the actions being organized, for example, by Palestine Action, ongoing at the Elbit weapons factories in the UK with some success. What role does that play in stopping arms exports? What do you think about that? And then also, I guess, a question which is probably aimed at how I opened from Fiona, which is, the new government have, to say the very least, been been disappointing. Why on earth could we have any hope that we can persuade them to stop selling arms to Israel and offering military assistance, given everything that they've said in opposition? Never mind now. I don't know if, I mean, Jeff, you're obviously not here, but you're very welcome to answer any of those questions. And maybe I'll just take you in that order, and feel free to pass if you don't have anything to say.
You're muted, Jeff.
Still muted, Jeff.
That order means that I begin?
Yes, if you've got anything you want to add on those kind of tactical questions.
Well, just briefly, you know, these are really all important things that you're doing, but of course, the missing piece here, and that's what we're trying to work on here in Palestine, is a political program. You can't be in a political struggle without a program. And as much as these actions are crucial, you know, they stop at a certain point unless you have something to advocate for in a political sense. I'm part of a Palestinian-led organization that's called the One Democratic State Campaign. And we've developed a 10-point political program that you can see on our website that's called onestatecampaign.org. And what I would really urge, and especially I think with the PYN people, is to have more contact with the Palestinian activists here. I feel, and you know, maybe it's not my place to say this as a not a Palestinian, but you know, I feel there's a disconnect between, you know, in a way, the protests are really important and really great abroad, but they haven't brought in Palestinians from here. And at the same time, the really strategic and difficult struggle of Palestinians here to come together and even talk to each other behind a political program with the repression that's going on, and of course the dispersal and so on, really means that they need a lot more support from the diaspora as well. So I guess I'm trying to think in terms of a political solution that has to come from Palestine. It has to be led by Palestinians. And I think we just have to strengthen and you know, make the tie closer between what you're all doing abroad and in the diaspora and what's happening here in Palestine.
Thanks, Jeff. And that's something for us to think about as an organization as well. But maybe if you would put a link, if you can, in the chat to your to the One Democratic State, that would be really, really useful. Thank you. Yasmin.
Thank you, Nick. Yeah, I have a couple of reflections, and also just thinking about what you're saying, Jeff. I agree that, like, the, you know, deepening the connections between Palestinians in exile, and like also the way that we understand the struggle to have like a regional dimension, means that in the Palestinian youth movement, for example, last summer, we organized a delegation to Lebanon, and the purpose of that delegation was to build relationships with a lot of different organizations, especially organizations working with youth in the camps. And there are relationships that exist between like organizations in Palestine and the Palestinian youth movement, and we see that as a really important part of our work. But also, based on the experience that we've built and the different kinds of strategies that we've pursued, the way that we understand our role primarily to be as generating crisis where in exile, like where we exist. And it's speaking exactly to like the kind of display of the world system that you illustrated in your initial contribution, but also the points Bianca made at the end of her contribution. But just on the question of tactics and how you relate to the current British government, or like the new government, I think that we can think of like all of these different tactics that are taken up as necessary. Like, we need people who are doing direct action, or organizations that are facilitating that, just as we need, you know, like the mass mobilizations that happen every few Saturdays, and we need the pickets. Like, we need all these different expressions of the movement, and it's the culminating like it's the culmination of all these different tactics that's like putting this level of pressure on the government. And I think that rather than framing it as like, you know, eventually we're going to convince the government, I really want to like elaborate kind of the framework that Bianca set up of like, it's not based on like how these wins are going to be achieved isn't based on like generating enough sympathy or like appearing to some kind of moral consciousness. It's going to be about how much power we can build and how disruptive we can be, but also thinking and again also even thinking to like what you were talking about, Jonathan, about like the historical precedents and like when these wins were made possible was because like it basically got too expensive or too politically costly for the British government to continue to support whether it was like the arms licensing in 2008 or whatever. We need to be able to generate enough crisis that that it basically becomes too costly for the Labour government to continue supporting the Zionist entity. And I think that the movement has been successful. Like the biggest dividing factor on this like ballot, even though obviously neither party like actually represented the will of like the majority of the British public, was Palestine in a lot of ways. And I think that is a testament to the strength of the movement. But I don't say that naively. I think that it's important for us to understand that, because understanding the strength of the movement gives us hope, but also it really should make us all feel a massive sense of responsibility that has to be held onto and protected. And that means we need to become more organized. And that means that you don't see Palestine as like Bianca was saying, something that you're doing as extra to whatever struggles you've got going on locally, but it's actually part and parcel of how our world is organized. And when we increase the strength of like the workers' movement, labor movement in this country, we actually heighten the political possibility for what we can do for Palestinians in Gaza. And seeing that relationship, like for that relationship to be clarified between what political power we have and what we can offer to Palestinians in Palestine, in the same way that like what Palestinian resistance across Palestine has done was also heighten the possibility of political action in this country. Like it's a two-way relationship. And so that's kind of the framework that we can think of, like where the movement is going and how we can like propel the movement and how we hold on to the gains made in the last 10 months.
Thank you, Yasmin. Blanca, could I come to you next? Because Jonathan, you're welcome to comment on these questions, but I've got some specific ones for you as well. So if it's okay, I'll come to you last.
Yeah, absolutely. I resonate with everything Yasmin has just said. I believe like on the question of like Palestine Action and other organizations and groups, like it's been really beautiful to see. Obviously Palestine Action has been active for 3 to 4 years, but like the multiplicity of organizing that has come up of the last 8 months, and if anything can give us hope for the future, and also an understanding that this struggle is a long-term struggle and it will not end when a possible ceasefire is stated. And I think like we can assure that like every organization, every collective, every action that we're building toward is also building not only different consciousness and different test of collective power, but it's also building the future of the Palestinian solidarity movement in this country. I think different organizations have different strategies and tactics. They're all valid, and I don't think at this point we can afford to not have them. Yeah, I think that was on the question of like the different movements and the question of the motions for trade unions. We believe in a rank and file strategy. The leadership of the trade unions has never represented workers, and hasn't for a long time. The unions have been like absolutely dismantled from top of the structure, and I think like we use motions as a way of like talking with with colleagues, with talking with people in the workplace, in the same way that we use pins or we use flags or we use any sort of prompt to be able to start a conversation in the workplace, because we know that each conversation can go a long way in organizing your union, not only as a rep, but as a rank and file. Anyone can organize in the workplace. You do not need a motion to start organizing with your colleagues. There are things that are really, really small that can then like start building up. And we've seen this with tech workers organizing. We've seen this with healthcare workers organizing. You do not need to start organizing direct action in your workplace either. And you do not need the permission of the union, as we've seen from statements from Unite, which is one of the majoritarian trade unions representing arms workers. They were not interested on having a discussion over what an arms embargo would look like. And I think it's been a really interesting development to see their own arms workers, as I was saying, like responding to that statement from different political and ideological backgrounds. But yeah, I guess like my short response to that would be use motions or anything you can as strategically as you can to build collective power in the rank and file movement. And I'm not sure if I'm missing any other question. Someone is asking, I'm nervous to attend direct action like blockades, as I would be on my own, but I'm keen to do so as I think it's important. Is there a way to build community? Yeah, absolutely. So we have two briefing. Is there a way to build community before the action? They were asking. We have two briefing calls that we will send the details to. These are meetings where we will be meeting the people that is going to be attending. And we'll also ask you to bring anyone that you know. If you can bring your roommate, if you can bring your kids, if you can bring your mom. These are conversations that also start with your immediate colleagues. And I'm not even joking. Like the group of groups of like grandmas and mothers have been coming to the pickets, and has been really joyful to see. And this internet, and also people that has been struggling for the health of arms supplies for a very long time, and seeing these intergenerational struggles feed into each other and how the movement has been developing is also one of the I think most of the beautiful things of taking action together and collectively. I do hope to see many of you next week.
Thank you, Blanca. And then Jonathan, you're welcome to comment on any of that, as I say, but there were two kind of more legally questions. I mean, one was this question of the government's legal advice on arms, which the Tories never released to us. Labour asked them to release it to us. You know, what potential is there to push them to make good on that promise in coming weeks? And then there's a question here about an issue I don't know about, which is when can we expect the War Crimes Unit of the British Police to act on the ICJP's complaint against British ministers, specifically those Tory ministers who've recently left office? I don't know about that, but maybe you do.
Yeah, sure. So I'll answer a little bit on the organisation first, and then I'll get on to the other two, if that's all right. So a lot of what people have already said, and what I said in my section as well, which is that there has to be many strings to the bow. You know, there's legal advocacy, like my organisation, there's political lobbying, grassroots protesting, student encampments, direct action, union action, financial and cultural boycotts. None of these things achieve systemic change in isolation. We can't silo into certain tactics, and different organizations doing different things does create this pressure that can create this change. And speaking of building these broad coalitions, that's true within Parliament as well. So I'll speak a bit about that because I'm more in the political world than the grassroots world. And you know, there's understandable disappointment with this new Labour government, which again, I'll get onto in this legal advice question in a second. But there are some incredible backbenchers still within Labour who are not part of the cabinet. So even today, Zara Sultana, she called for an amendment to the King's Speech at the state opening of Parliament, specifically calling for an end to arms sales. So she's really pushing the envelope on this particular issue. She created a private members bill a few months ago on it as well. So there's ways to put pressure on the Labour government, even from within the party. And then we've got these 5 fantastic independent MPs who have been elected. We were unlucky not to have more, actually. Leanne Mohammed up in Ilford North, nearly unseated Wes Streeting. So we've got those 4 Green MPs who you would imagine all are likely to be very strong on Palestine. Many within other parties like the Lib Dems, the SNP, Plaid Cymru, the Social Democrat Labour Party in Northern Ireland. There's lots of pro-Palestinians and even a handful of Conservatives. So only yesterday we had a press conference with the former Conservative Foreign Minister, Sir Alan Duncan. He was very outspoken on Palestine to the extent that the party launched an investigation into him, a smear on anti-Semitism, which he was exonerated from. But, you know, there's unlikely allies in every little corner. And I think united action is the way to bring about that systemic change. And that needs allies from everywhere across the political spectrum and across different subsections in terms of different advocacy routes as well. So that's all I wanted to say on organizing. On the legal advice, yes, absolutely. Labour did say that they would release it when they got into power. They're yet to do it so far. We'll see if they do. But certainly that is something that would be a huge U-turn were they not to do it. We've already seen this week that there's potential U-turns in other places. It's been briefed in the media, but it's not yet been officially announced. But there's rumours that Labour may choose to intervene in the International Criminal Court case when they previously said that they would not. So there's worrying signs that Labour may not do what they said that they would when they were in opposition. Legal advice on arms is one of the biggest ones for that. They have said, regardless of whether they publish what the Conservatives had access to, and it's important to say that they do have access to that. It's unclear. People have said it's unclear whether or not they do. They do have access to it. The civil servants produced it for the previous government, and the civil servants would produce near identical advice for the new government. So they have the new advice, or they will shortly, and they've said that they will review arms exports once they have it. Now, the question is whether that review amounts to anything. It's clear, if what Alicia Kearns said is true, that this legal advice would mean that arms exports would have to immediately be suspended. And if Labour don't do that, then there would be clear avenues for legal action at that juncture. So that's all I would say on the legal advice. And then for the final question, if I'm right in saying it's about the complaint against British ministers. So I'll give a bit of context before answering the question. It's great to hear that some of the audience know about ICJP's work already, but I won't assume that everyone does. So what that is referring to is ICJP sent a dossier with over 700 pages of evidence to Scotland Yard's War Crimes Unit. And it identified people who should be investigated by the War Crimes Unit. This included 5 British ministers. It included British nationals fighting for the Israeli Defense Forces, and it included Israeli ministers as well. So once Scotland Yard has this evidence, which they now have, they can use it to open an investigation to pursue British domestic arrest warrants, but also they can hand that information on to The Hague for the International Criminal Court to pursue international arrest warrants. And I think that question had 3 questions within it. So the first one was about Tory ministers who have recently left office. So the most important thing to say is that leaving office does nothing to let Conservative ministers off the hook for what they did whilst they were in office as public servants. On the arms case that I discussed today, the Glan and al-Haq one, that is aimed at Conservative ministers in the Foreign Office and the Business and Trade Office for what they did when they were in power. They're not in power anymore, but in October, they will have to answer for that. And that would apply here as well. So there's no worries that them being out of government does anything to hinder the accountability process. And then the next question was about no signs of a police investigation having been opened yet. So an important thing to say about that is that the War Crimes Unit won't necessarily announce a case, even if it has been opened. So sometimes entire cases are carried out, and sometimes even arrest warrants are issued without any public announcement. So it's theoretically possible that an individual could be arrested before Scotland Yard have even said that they've put out a warrant. That could also be the case for the ICC, by the way. We've been waiting for arrest warrants there. It's possible that they've been issued and sealed. So that would apply here as well. And then the final bit of that question was what requirements have to be met for the police to investigate ministers. So the only requirement that needs to be met is that ministers are aiding and abetting war crimes and crimes against humanity. That's it. And that can come in at least two clear different ways. It can be an action. So continuing to grant arms export licenses, that would be an action that would be deemed as aiding and abetting war crimes. And then there could also be rhetoric, such as justifying the restriction of humanitarian aid. So back in October and November, when people were saying Israel has a right to defend itself and not prefacing it with saying that that included within the realms of international law, saying that Israel has an unfettered right to defend itself, saying Israel has the right to restrict humanitarian aid, even those comments could be seen as aiding and abetting war crimes. So it can be either actions or comments, and if there's evidence, which in our opinion it is there, that's why we've submitted that evidence to them, then it's up to the War Crimes Unit to investigate it properly and pursue their investigation and potentially issue arrest warrants. So hopefully that's a good answer to that question, and answers all the different subsections you had.
It's brilliant. Thank you, Jonathan. So we're going to go on for another 10 minutes, maybe. So we'll do a quick other round. So I'm going to go back to you all in a similar order. I'm going to try and filter the questions to who I think can probably answer them best. But feel free to answer each other's questions too, and anything you'd like to say by way of wrapping up as well. So there's a few questions here that I think maybe are interesting for both Jeff and Yasmin. So I'll start with you again, Jeff. There's a question here asked early on around within Israel, do people see Palestinians as somehow subhuman in a way that you can compare with South Africa or even back how British people consider black slaves, and is that does it provide an explanation of how that kind of how what we're seeing can happen? I think there's a question here around, which I find very interesting, around the comparison between South Africa and Israel, and the differences between, for example, Hamas and the ANC, and how that changes our understanding of that. And then a question around possibilities for convergence, which is very, very difficult from my understanding, but more than I do, around convergence of Israeli and Palestinian movements in order to demand peace and a just settlement. Jeff, can I hand that over to you, and anything else you'd like to say to finish off?
Okay, that's a lot in 10 minutes, and other people have to speak too. Just let me say really quickly, again, in terms of the dehumanization of Palestinians, which of course is a reality, again, we have to get into the logic of the settler colonial enterprise. Settler colonialism it's an academic term. It's even a mouthful that somehow escaped academia and got into the public discourse, which is a good thing. But it's a very complex but very important term, and sometimes it isn't really understood. And I think it really has to be, what we're trying to do, certainly what I'm trying to do, is really to lay out what it actually means, because not only is it important for understanding what's happening to Palestinians and why there's genocide and why Israel is doing what it's doing and why the world supports Israel, but it's also important in terms of a political program, because any political program has to flow from the problem. You know, any treatment of a disease has to flow from the diagnosis. Settler colonialism is a diagnosis, and without understanding what it means, you can't really address the issues it contains and get to a political program that we believe is, or I believe is a one democratic state program. So in the sense in settler colonialism, then, it's not so much you're not dehumanizing the other, you're erasing the other. There is no other. There is no other. In other words, settler colonialism is unilateral. It's when any foreign people, I mean, you know, the British and the Pilgrims did that in North America with Manifest Destiny. There's a lot of places where that's happened, where simply a foreign population targets a country and invents a narrative of why that country belongs to it, to that people, and not to the indigenous population, and then unilaterally goes to take it over and to and basically to re-indigenize it with themselves. So in that process, of course, it's unilateral. The indigenous population have nothing to do with it. They've never been in a fight. It's not a conflict. And I'm always trying to say we have to stop using the word conflict, because that makes Israel, that makes a settler colonial entity aside. It gives it legitimacy, and there's a certain false symmetry here. We have to watch our language. So settler colonialism gives us a language. It gives us a way to understand. I think Palestinians from that point of view are simply erased. And then, of course, what it does, what all colonial movements does, is, you know, they're erased, but they're still there. I mean, they're obviously in Gaza and all around the Palestinians. And so you criminalize the resistance. And that's why, again, language is important. You know, we have to come back when they use words like terrorism, words that are criminalized, that criminalize resistance. We have to come back with an anti-colonial, you know, anti-imperial language that people don't have. People don't really have an alternative to terrorism. You know, we have to put it in terms of resistance. So I think we have a lot of work to do in terms of framing. I think that's where the question is really important, in terms of framing not only what the Palestinian struggle is, but in a sense, what the struggle is against settler colonialism, because that has a lot to do with a lot of other parts of the world as well. So, you know, and we draw a lot of inspiration from South Africa. But I don't think I have time really to get into that too much. I want to leave time for other people. But just your last point about, you know, the convergence of Israelis and Palestinians, there isn't really a convergence. I mean, there's no convergence between the colonizers and the colonized, and the colonizers, like the whites in South Africa, aren't going to agree to any kind of genuine justice and dismantling of the colonial regime. So what we're trying to work on, like the ANC did, the ANC understood that the whites weren't going to be partners in dismantling apartheid. Why would they be? And so but the ANC had a political program. It was one person, one vote. Everybody knew what they were boycotting, you know, what they were fighting, and so on. That's missing again in the Palestinian context. But once that's in place, I think the Palestinians will take the lead. They'll be supported by anti-Zionist Israelis like me, just like they were very important white figures in the ANC, but their real allies are all of you. You know, it was the international grassroots, to a large degree, not completely, that caused the collapse of the apartheid regime, made it unsustainable. I think that's what Blanc is talking about, making these regimes unsustainable. And that's something we can do it in that way. I think we could replicate the ANC, and then Afterwards, you get to a transition to democracy where without a choice, the whites in South Africa or the Israelis have to come into a more democratic regime in which they simply become citizens, and we begin to build, one democratic state. There's a lot to say about that, but I won't get into that now. So in other words, what I'm just saying in the end is that what will bring us together is, I think, a one democratic state political program and strategic working together as comrades in an anti-colonial struggle, but not to expect any kind of convergence between the general public of Israelis and Palestinians.
Thank you, Jeff. That's really, really helpful. And I saw you put in the chat that you will be in the UK later in the year. So we'll talk about that, and maybe people can see you in person. Yasmin, do you want to comment on any of that? And also, there's another question here which may be interesting to you, coming from a youth movement, student movement perspective, that war is also a climate change issue. And in its 9 months of genocide in Gaza, Israel has produced more greenhouse gases than France produces in a whole year, apparently, which is shocking. And it does seem to me that, trying to build a connection between what's happening in Palestine and the climate movement is something that we as an organization could play a movement in, and could be powerful. I'll hand over to you.
Yeah, I don't want to repeat what Jeff said, because I think a lot of what he said answered these questions, but I just want to add a few points, which is that I think to complement what our analysis of like what's actually happening on the ground in Palestine is settler colonialism, we also need to understand that settler colonialism is enabled and facilitated by imperialism. And you see, like, for example, Biden saying my numbers are doing better in Israel than they're doing in the US. And I think that's like something really important, because it's not sometimes when we see such exponential violence, your mind immediately goes to like sadism or to like, psychoanalytic explanations of these violence, which are important. I'm not dismissing that. But it's also like, what are the material interests in the maintenance of the Zionist entity? Like, why is that so important to US imperialism? Why is it so important to the British ruling class? And that begins to help us understand why this level of violence is being meted out in Gaza, and what kind of a challenge is Gaza posing to the world order. Like, that's the scales of this confrontation that we're witnessing in Gaza. And on comparisons to like the ANC and even other like liberation struggles, Vietnam, Algeria, you need to be thinking about all these resistance formations that emerge are informed by the realities of their struggles. Like, there was a particular political, economic, social makeup of the apartheid regime in South Africa. There was a particular form of genocidal violence in Algeria. There was, like the productive capacity of the entirety of US imperialism destroying Vietnamese society. And we're seeing a different manifestation of that in Gaza. And all of this is informing like the forms of resistance that emerge in response to that. So I think when we do these comparisons, we should be thinking about like the different realities that inform what kinds of resistance emerge. And that's perhaps the most effective way of analyzing these different struggles and thinking about what's happening in Palestine. And there are efforts amongst the Palestinian factions towards a political program. There are efforts since 2021, we've witnessed the emergence of like unity across all fronts as like a strategy that is being pursued across factions and across geographies, that is really important to understand what has been happening over the last couple of years and why we've seen this like massive transformation in the Palestinian struggle. And finally, on the question of climate change, I really love the work of Energy Embargo for Palestine. I think they're doing an incredible job. We work with them closely at trying to inject, like, alongside other organizations, trying to inject anti-imperialist politics into the climate movement, but also centering energy and like climate change in the Palestine movement. And I think it's a great way of doing that both ways. So yeah, like that's another way to understand the like complete destruction of infrastructure, the complete destruction of like nature in Gaza as like part and parcel of, the genocidal violence and this idea of like, what is the productive capacity of our world going towards? It's going towards destroying the entire like life life enabling capacity of in Gaza, and that's also a really important way of thinking about like how climate change is manifesting in like quote unquote war zones. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Yasmin. I'd like to talk to you more about that sometime as well, how we can make those linkages, because they're really important for our work. Very sadly, Blanca's had to leave. So Jonathan, we've just got you to wrap up. So I can't, sorry, there was a question about campaigns around the changing, whether you can change arms manufacturers to more socially useful products, which I will go and find out about myself, and maybe we can get back to you. The final question I had was one about, with all the protest criminalization that's going on, there was somebody who said Roger Hallam was arrested for just being on a Zoom chat. Is there a danger, with increasingly with just discussing these issues like we are doing to our kind of civil liberties? So if you're able to address that, then do. But otherwise, with any final comments from you, Jonathan, would be great.
Sure. Yeah, I'd like to come in really quickly on the last two as well, if that's okay. On the South Africa and apartheid question, I did an entire dissertation on South African, Palestinian, Northern Irish comparisons. Would love to talk your ear off, but I'll leave you all off. What I will say is that from a legal lens, apartheid as a term, we've already seen major reports from Al Haq, Human Rights Watch, B'Tselem, and Amnesty in the past few years, which has been really helpful as a comparative advocacy tool. But the International Court of Justice will be doing a ruling on Friday, which may we'll see, may include a ruling on apartheid. And were that to happen, that would be a major step forward, being able to take the legitimacy of the ICJ, despite attempts to undermine its legitimacy. Their ruling on that would be huge. That's all I wanted to say on apartheid. On climate justice, before I worked at ICJP, I worked at Greenpeace. It's something I find very interesting, the intersectional aspect of those two struggles. It's something that has indeed happened in the war in Gaza, but has happened under the Israeli settler colonial system well before that. So there's two important things to say on that matter. The destruction of olive trees in the West Bank by settler communities is a major, major environmental, cultural, and economic disaster that has been happening in the October harvest season, year in, year out, for many, many years now. It's also settler organizations have planted non-native trees in their place, which have created forest fire risks to a very large degree. And then on the other side, there's also water apartheid, where Palestinians are restricted the amount of water that they can have. Israelis use water. They have a far higher quantity allocated to them. Irrigation systems are used to grow non-native plants, whilst Palestinian people do not have the water available to them. This is not just a war issue. This is an inherent climate issue related to Israel more generally. And then, sorry, the final question I'll answer in 1 minute. What was it again?
Criminalization of protest, including just talking about protest.
Yeah, okay. So as we were saying with regards to the importance of direct action, under the Conservative government, we've seen the Public Order Act brought in, the Police Crime and Sentencing Act brought in, new special measures brought in last month, facial measures. It is a truly dystopian Orwellian system we've seen. We haven't seen enough from the Labour manifesto to say that these will be overturned. And it's really, really troubling. It undermines civil liberties more generally, not just how it connects to Palestine, as important as that is, but simply the fabric of democracy in the UK itself as well. And that is an utterly terrifying development. With regards to just speaking about something being an issue, the anti-boycott bill was actually defeated when the last government ended, but that had an extraordinary measure in it. So it was targeting local councils, saying that they couldn't boycott Israeli goods, as well as other ones too. But not only that, there was a double gagging clause, which said that not only could local government officials not boycott Israeli goods, but they also could say that they would hypothetically boycott them if it were legal to do so. It was a double gagging clause that even Orwell wouldn't dream up himself. It's astounding. And this is just one example of the erosion of civil liberties in our society, which has a huge impact on the Palestinian movement generally, but civil liberties more broadly.
Thank you so much. It's just been so great to hear from all of you. It is a horrific time watching what's happening for all of us, but feeling part of a community and feeling part of a movement around this is the thing that's going to keep us going. So I really, really appreciate, thank you, Blanca, Jeff, Jonathan, and Yasmin, your time this evening. Two very quick announcements from me. First of all, again, I'm going to plug the Workers for a Free Palestine events next Wednesday. I really hope to see some of you on the streets there, if you're able to get down. And very, very finally, I'm pleased that we've come to this issue, albeit late, and I'm pleased with what we've done over the last few months. We are only able to do what we do because we are essentially funded by ordinary supporters and activists like you. So if for any reason you are not already a member of Global Justice Now, please, please, please do join us, get involved at a local level, get involved at a national level, and keep working with us on this issue. Yasmin said earlier that as long as we are still speaking, as long as we are still protesting, as long as we are still out there, we have not been defeated. So keep going, stay strong, look after yourself, and I really look forward to seeing you all again very, very soon. Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Jeff.
Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, you.